The Kimmel studio was already tense before Meghan Markle made her entrance. Not chaotic, not loud, just tight, like the moment before a storm breaks. Meghan had been booked to promote an upcoming humanitarian initiative and speak about empowerment. What she wasn't prepared for was a bated tone from Jimmy Kimmel. He'd agreed to a respectful conversation, or so she'd been told. The producer's whisper came just as she adjusted her mic. He's bringing on the contrarian angle tonight. Heads up. Meghan didn't flinch. She breathed in, held steady. When the cameras rolled, the applause was kind. Curiosity, not adulation. Meghan gave a soft nod, a composed smile, and sat gracefully across from Jimmy. Seconds later, he chimed in with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Jimmy said, "Meghan, thanks for being here. People love what you're doing. But let's be honest, royalty and humanitarianism? It's a compelling combo. But some say that mix is a PR stunt. What do you say to critics who think it's more photo op than policy?" Meghan paused. Her voice was calm but firm. "I say impact isn't about optics. It's about action. The causes we support and the change we drive. That's what matters." Jimmy leaned in, his tone sharpened. "Sure, but when you're part of a very specific brand, then ask for privacy. Isn't that tone deaf?" That pulled a reaction. Meghan tilted her head. The balance between public presence and personal boundaries isn't mutually exclusive. You can use a platform and still protect your privacy. Jimmy pressed. But celebrities leverage that negotiation for screen time. Where's the line? Meghan responded evenly. The line is honesty. My goal tonight isn't to entertain doubt. It's to speak truth to purpose. A murmur swept through the audience. Now, before you hear what Meghan says next, and why it triggered a showdown that almost never made air, you need to decide where you stand. Most late-night moments are polished, edited, predictable. This moment was neither. If you want to see the question no one planned on asking and the truth no one wanted broadcast, hit that subscribe button right now. Because when Meghan responds next, you'll see why she and the network found themselves at an impasse. Jimmy leaned forward, voice serious. All right, real talk. Some say you walked away from royal privilege. Others say you threw it away. Now you're trading royal headlines for Hollywood ones. Are you playing the long game? Or is this just another chapter in a personal rebrand? Meghan leaned back slightly, eyes steady and unwavering. Not a hint of surprise. Just resolve. She said softly, "It's not a game. It's a life. A life committed to service, no matter the spotlight. And yes, I'm still in the process of defining my own chapter, privately or publicly." There was a pause, a living pause. The kind that only comes when the topic touches something deeper than ratings. Jimmy swallowed. He looked at the crew, then at Meghan. He said, "That's not what I'm hearing." Meghan's gaze sharpened. She said, "Then maybe start listening differently." A hush fell across the studio. Cameras cut. Producers shuffled. The next segment began, but the room had changed. And Meghan? She sat still, not moving, until her next words broke the silence. Meghan's words didn't just settle into the air. They struck it. The silence that followed wasn't dead air. It was charged. The kind of silence that says, "Did that really just happen?" Jimmy shifted in his seat, trying to keep it light. He smiled tightly and said, all right. I hear you. Let's pivot then. You've got this initiative, Empower Rising. Tell us what that's about." Meghan nodded. Her posture didn't relax, but her voice was even. "It's a mentorship network. For young women who've been told they don't belong at the table. We're helping them build their own." The audience applauded softly. But Jimmy wasn't done. He said, "That's great. But some people say that it's a bit selective. High schools in Los Angeles? Ivy track students? That's not exactly underserved." Meghan blinked once. Not slowly. Not with drama. Just once, like resetting a lens. She said, "We focus where we have roots. Where we can build models that scale. If I waited for permission to start with perfection, I'd never begin." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "Sounds curated." Meghan responded, "Everything with intention looks curated to people who've only ever reacted." The audience gave a mix of sounds. A few claps. A few gasps. No laughter. Jimmy looked toward the producer. Then back to Meghan. "I'm just asking what people ask." "No," Meghan said, voice rising just slightly. "You're asking the way people tear down." Another silence. Jimmy tried to laugh it off. "Come on. Don't do this. It's a conversation." Meghan leaned forward. Her voice was low but carried. "This is what women face. especially women of color. You walk into a room thinking you've been invited to discuss your work, but quickly you realize you were invited to defend your right to be there. Jimmy said, "Whoa, no one's asking you to defend." "You already did," Meghan cut in, with every question framed to question the authenticity of my actions. My past, my future, my motives. A few audience members started clapping. Jimmy raised a hand. "Let's just take a breath." But Meghan wasn't done. "You say this is about public interest, but what you're doing is something else. You're repeating the pattern. You bait women into being either perfectly poised or irreparably flawed. And when we choose to just be human, you call that difficult." Jimmy tried to redirect. "Look, I respect what you're doing." "No," Meghan said. "You tried to appear respectful. There's a difference." The audience was silent again. Tension sat in every row. Now, before what happens next, you need to understand the shift that was taking place. Meghan Markle had just appended the late-night script. She wasn't playing along. And Jimmy Kimmel, who had made a career out of riding the line between charm and provocation, was about to fall off it completely. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the time. Because what Meghan does next is the reason this segment almost never aired in full. This wasn't just an interview. This was the moment a guest refused to be a character in someone else's monologue. Jimmy forced a smile and said, "All right, we'll be right back after this." But Meghan stood up. She didn't wait for the commercial break. She didn't look angry. She looked clear. Meghan said, "I'm done." Jimmy blinked. "Excuse me. I came here for a conversation," she said. "Not a performance. And not a quiet character assassination masked as a Q&A. "You're overreacting," Jimmy said. Meghan looked directly into the camera. "To every woman watching, especially the ones who've worked twice as hard just to be questioned twice as often, this is what it looks like. And it has to stop." She placed her microphone on the chair, then turned to leave. Jimmy stood up. "Meghan, come on. You're walking out? That's what you want people to see." "No," she said, still walking. "I want people to see that dignity doesn't require permission. It just requires a limit. And this is mine." The door shut behind her, and the studio stayed still. The door hadn't been closed for more than 10 seconds when the studio erupted, not in cheers or applause, but in quiet chaos. Camera operators froze. The control booth scrambled to cut to commercial, and Jimmy Kimmel stood at center stage, unsure whether to salvage the moment or let it fade. But it wouldn't fade. Not this time. The producers quickly huddled around him during the break. One asked, "Do we air this?" Another muttered, "We might need to retape." Jimmy didn't respond. He looked toward the empty chair where Meghan had been. A single microphone lay across the cushion, perfectly still. When the show resumed, the audience was quieter. Jimmy forced a smile. "Well," he said, "that was a moment. Meghan Markle, everyone. She's passionate. We respect that." But it felt hollow. The crowd knew it. The internet would too. Within minutes of airing, cell phone footage taken by someone in the audience hit social media. It captured the moment Meghan stood up, removed her mic, and spoke into the camera. The video spread fast. Within an hour, it had 2 million views. People weren't debating whether Meghan had overreacted. They were asking why the same tactics kept getting used on the same kind of guest. One tweet said, "They invite strong women, then act surprised when they don't play submissive." Another read, "She didn't storm off. She stood up." And sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do. The hashtags began to trend. Hashtag Meghan stood. Hashtag respect the guest. Hashtag not your script. Meanwhile, Meghan remained silent. She left the studio in the back seat of a black SUV, windows up. Her team said nothing to the press. There was no post-interview tweet. No Instagram story. No PR spin. Just stillness. The network went into damage control. Internally, there were conflicting reactions. Some believed Jimmy had gone too far. Others blamed Meghan for being overly sensitive. A few younger staff members spoke up, saying this wasn't a one-time issue. It was a pattern. The next morning, one of them leaked the prep sheet for Meghan's interview. Among the talking points was a bullet that read, "Ask about contradiction between craving privacy and doing Netflix specials." That wasn't journalism. That was provocation. And people saw it for what it was. A few celebrities weighed in. Viola Davis posted a quote from the interview and added, "Know your worth. And know when to walk away." Gabrielle Union tweeted, "The fact that she didn't yell makes it louder." But the most unexpected response came from someone who had been silent for months. Prince Harry, in a rare public statement, he said, Meghan has never asked for privilege, only fairness. And when she's denied even that, she still responds with grace. That's the kind of strength I stand beside. That quote made front-page news, not because of who said it, but because of what it revealed. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a crack in the carefully built wall around late-night television, the wall that allowed hosts to provoke, belittle, and then hide behind the format. And now that wall had a name carved into it, Meghan. Now, before you see how this moment transformed the industry's approach to interviews, consider this. What if every guest felt empowered to leave when respect was withheld? What if audiences stopped applauding setups and started recognizing sincerity? That's why this moment matters. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Because what happens next proves that one act of quiet resistance can echo louder than any monologue. Jimmy Kimmel addressed it in his next opening segment. He said, "Look, the Meghan thing, that got a little out of hand. But I've always been about asking tough questions." But people didn't buy it. Because what Meghan faced weren't tough questions. They were rehearsed jabs disguised as curiosity. And what she gave in return wasn't a meltdown. It was a boundary. The headlines didn't fade. They didn't get buried under celebrity gossip or trending scandals. Meghan's quiet exit stayed planted in the cultural conversation because it struck something deeper than outrage. It raised a question no one could quite look away from. Why did that moment feel familiar to so many? The answer came not from pundits or journalists, but from everyday people, especially women, who began sharing their own stories. Stories of job interviews where the questions weren't really questions. Stories of meetings where speaking up meant being labeled difficult. Stories of being asked to shrink, just a little, to fit into someone else's comfort. Teachers, nurses, engineers, artists. They didn't all have microphones, but they had something else, recognition. And recognition became resonance. Meanwhile, Jimmy Kimmel's show carried on. But something had shifted. Ratings dipped slightly. Sponsors asked questions. Younger audiences especially were vocal. They weren't canceling him. They were just disengaging. And that stung more. On his next few episodes, Jimmy leaned harder into comedy. Softer guests. No politics. No confrontation. Just bits and banter. But the echo of Meghan's departure was still there. Her name kept coming up, even when the show tried to move on. Back at her home in California, Meghan remained largely quiet. Until a week later, when she appeared on a podcast hosted by a former news anchor. The episode wasn't promoted. No ads. No social media blitz. Just an hour of conversation released quietly on a Friday morning. But by noon, it had 5 million downloads. Because what Meghan said wasn't dramatic. It was honest. She said, "I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I've learned not to stay where I'm being asked to explain my existence." The host asked, "What were you feeling in that moment?" Meghan paused. "I was tired," she said. "Not physically, not even emotionally. Just tired of pretending that the disrespect is part of the package. That visibility comes with erasure. That if you want a voice, you have to let someone else script it." She wasn't bitter. She wasn't trying to go viral. She was just naming something that had gone unnamed for too long. The host asked, "Do you regret walking off?" Meghan smiled softly. "No. I regret how many times before that I didn't." That clip alone reached 20 million views in 48 hours. Suddenly, the moment on Jimmy Kimmel's show wasn't just about a celebrity clash. It was about how media, even under the guise of conversation, still punishes women who refuse to perform compliance. The View, The Late Show, network morning interviews. Producers began re-evaluating segment structures. Guest prep meetings changed. Some hosts issued public reminders that their shows were safe spaces for real dialogue. It was damage control, but it was also something more. It was acknowledgement. Now, before we reach the final part of this story, and the unexpected moment that turned the tables completely, think about what this story has already shown. Meghan Markle didn't explode. She didn't demand. She simply stood. And in standing, she reminded everyone watching that boundaries are not disrespectful. They are a form of self-respect. If you've been following this journey, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happens next proves that the world may resist change, but it can't ignore truth. 3 weeks after the incident, Jimmy Kimmel received an invitation. It wasn't from Meghan. It wasn't from a publicist. It was from a university journalism panel. They were hosting a conversation on media ethics. and they wanted Jimmy to speak. He declined, but the keynote speaker was Meghan, and what she said that night would become the final chapter in a moment that had already grown bigger than either of them. The auditorium was packed, not because Meghan Markle was there, but because what she represented had shifted. She wasn't just a public figure anymore. She had become a case study, a symbol, a quiet interruption in a loud media cycle that rarely lets people walk away with their dignity intact. The event was hosted by the university's journalism school. The theme was media responsibility in a post-truth era. There were panels on digital ethics, audience manipulation, and the collapsing line between entertainment and interrogation. Meghan was the closing keynote. She didn't arrive with an entourage. She didn't pose for photos. She walked in alone, carrying a single folder of notes. When she stepped onto the stage, there was polite applause. Not hysteria, not spectacle, just respect. She began by thanking the students for still believing in journalism. Then she paused. "I was asked to speak about media responsibility," she said. "But I can't do that without first speaking about media culture." She didn't mention Jimmy Kimmel by name. She didn't have to. She spoke about interview segments that masquerade as conversations, but are built like ambushes. She spoke about the pressure to be both vulnerable and invulnerable at once. To be raw, but polished. To be honest, but palatable. She said, "We're often told that visibility comes with a cost, but rarely are we allowed to question who's setting the price." Then she told a story that hadn't been shared before. She said, "The night before that interview, I almost canceled. Not because I was nervous, but because I had a feeling. That feeling," she said, "wasn't paranoia. It was memory. The memory of every time a smiling host had turned a question into a trap. The memory of being invited into a space only to find it wasn't built to hold her fully. Only the parts that were convenient, or entertaining, or quietly digestible. But she had gone anyway. Because I thought maybe this time would be different," she said. "And when it wasn't, I realized the difference would have to come from me." She described the moment she stood up as not an act of defiance, but one of clarity. When someone keeps trying to tell your story for you, the most radical thing you can do is walk away and keep telling it yourself. The room was still. Then she closed with this. "To everyone studying journalism in this room, ask better questions. Not louder ones. Not cleverer ones. Better ones. Because what we're building isn't just media. It's memory. And people will remember not just what we said, but how we made them feel when they said it." When she walked off stage, the crowd stood. Not because she was famous, but because they knew something had been said that would echo long after the lights dimmed. The fallout from her walkout didn't end with social media hashtags. It sparked internal reviews at multiple shows. New codes of conduct were drafted. Producers were asked to meet with guests in advance to review tone, not just content. One talk show even hired a media ethics consultant. As for Jimmy Kimmel, he never directly addressed the interview again. But 6 months later, during a segment with another guest, he paused before asking a personal question. He looked at the card, then set it down, and simply said, "Tell me what you want to talk about." The audience noticed. So did the guest. That was the change. Not a revolution of ratings, but a recalibration of respect. Meghan Markle didn't just walk off a stage that night. She walked into a role that had no script. And in doing so, she reminded the world, and every person watching, that dignity is not something given. It is claimed. And once claimed, it reshapes everything around it. Quietly, permanently, and with the force of someone who no longer waits to be understood. She speaks. And that is enough.